On the morning of February 7th, 1944, a German officer crouched in a frozen foxhole less than 100 meters from the American lines at Anzio, Italy. His hands shook, not from the cold. The Italian winter had turned the beachhead into a frozen wasteland of mud and ice, but from fear. For 2 weeks, he had watched something he could not explain. American paratroopers, wearing loose pants and moving like shadows, seemed to appear out of nowhere. They attacked suddenly, vanished just as quickly, and left German soldiers terrified. "I cannot sleep," he wrote in his diary, the words smudged with mud and blood. "They are everywhere. These black-hearted devils have no fear. I don't know where or when they will strike next." Within days, that German officer would die. His body was found by advancing American troops, and his diary was recovered. An American sergeant who spoke German translated the passage for his squad. They read it aloud in their own foxholes as artillery shells cracked in the distance. They laughed, a harsh, bitter sound in the freezing air, passing the diary from one soldier to another. Each man read it, memorized it, and repeated it. The words spread quickly through the regiment. Soldiers copied them onto scraps of paper, wrote them in letters home, and carried them in their minds. For men who had been fighting for weeks, losing friends and watching their companies shrink, those words carried meaning beyond medals or praise. The Germans feared them. The Germans could not sleep because of them. The Germans called them devils. And from that moment, the 504th Paratroop Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division became known as the Devils in Baggy Pants. They earned that name not in a single heroic act, not in one battle, but through relentless fighting that broke the spirit of every German soldier sent to destroy them. The 504th Paratroop Infantry Regiment was activated on May 1st, 1942, at Fort Benning, Georgia. The United States had been at war for less than 5 months. Airborne warfare, dropping soldiers from planes behind enemy lines, was still new and experimental. No army had ever done it on a large scale. The men who volunteered knew they were stepping into the unknown. Training was brutal, designed to push human endurance to its limits. Before dawn, they ran miles in Georgia's heat. They climbed ropes until their hands bled. They did push-ups and sit-ups until their muscles failed. They learned to pack their parachutes perfectly because one small mistake could kill them. They practiced jumping from planes at 400 feet while traveling at 120 miles per hour. They practiced landing without breaking bones and fighting immediately after hitting the ground, often surrounded by enemies and sometimes alone. The instructors were harsh. If one man showed weakness, the entire platoon was punished. Those who quit were humiliated and sent back to regular infantry units. Many washed out. In some training cycles, over 40% of volunteers dropped out. Those who remained were forged into a new kind of soldier. They were younger than regular infantry, averaging just 22 years old. They were physically strong, mentally tough, and earned an extra $50 per month in hazardous duty pay, a mark that set them apart. They called themselves paratroopers and called ordinary soldiers legs, a term of contempt for those who walked into battle instead of falling from the sky. They believed they were the best, and they were determined to prove it. Colonel Reuben Henry Tucker took command of the 504th in December 1942. He was 31, one of the youngest regimental commanders in the U.S. Army. Tucker had graduated from West Point in 1935 after failing out once due to poor math grades. He fought to return, refused to quit, and eventually graduated. His determination would define his career. Tucker volunteered for the paratroopers when the program was still risky and experimental. Senior officers warned him it could end his career. He ignored them. He wanted to lead soldiers in combat. He wanted to be at the front. Tucker was aggressive, almost reckless, caring little for paperwork or rules. A story circulated that when he left Italy, he had a crate full of charges against soldiers for minor infractions. Instead of processing them, he threw the crate into the Mediterranean. His men admired him for it. General James Gavin, who commanded the 505th Paratroop Infantry Regiment and later the entire 82nd Airborne Division, said Tucker was probably the best regimental commander of the war. Coming from a man of such high regard, that was extraordinary praise. Tucker led from the front. He jumped with his men on every operation. He was at the point of attack, making decisions in the heat of battle. He was wounded multiple times, but always returned to his regiment as soon as possible. He demanded two principles above all else: strike the target and hold the objective. This became the regiment's motto: strike, hold. They would attack aggressively and never give up ground they had taken. Other units might retreat when facing danger, but the 504th would not. In April 1943, the regiment boarded the troop ship George Washington and sailed for North Africa. They arrived in Casablanca and began training for their first combat jump, the invasion of Sicily. They practiced night jumps over the Tunisian desert, studied maps of drop zones, cleaned and cleaned their weapons again, and wrote letters home, many of which they would never send. The invasion was scheduled for July 1943. The 504th would jump on the second night, reinforcing the 505th who had landed the night before. But what happened next would haunt survivors forever. On the night of July 11, 1943, 144 transport aircraft carrying 2,000 paratroopers flew from Tunisia towards Sicily. Their path took them over the Allied fleet anchored off the coast. Naval commanders had set up safe corridors and coordinated recognition signals. Pilots were told to flash amber position lights to show they were friendly, but it didn't matter. Earlier that day, German bombers had attacked the fleet. Sailors and anti-aircraft crews were exhausted and jumpy. When the first C-47 transports appeared, someone thought they were returning German planes. One gun fired, then another. Soon, the fleet erupted in a storm of friendly fire. The slow transport planes were not built to maneuver under fire. Pilots tried to avoid shells, but planes collided or flew into the paths of others. The night sky lit up with tracer rounds, and men on board faced a terrifying, deadly scene. The formations broke apart almost as soon as they crossed the coast. Some pilots turned back toward Tunisia, still carrying their paratroopers. Others searched desperately for any open space to drop their men. Inside the aircraft, the soldiers watched shells tear through the fuselage. Men sitting next to friends suddenly slumped dead. Blood pooled on the floors. The smell of burning fuel and twisted metal filled the cabins. Jump masters screamed for the men to hook up and prepare to jump, but many aircraft were already on fire. In total, 23 aircraft were shot down. 37 more were badly damaged. Some paratroopers died while still strapped in their seats. Others leapt from burning planes only to be shot while descending in their parachutes. Some drowned when their planes crashed into the Mediterranean. The official records listed over 400 casualties, including 81 confirmed dead, but some historians believe the true number was even higher. One plane that made it back to Tunisia had over 1,000 bullet holes in its fuselage. Ground crews could not understand how it had stayed in the air. Colonel Tucker's aircraft flew twice along the coast, desperately searching for the drop zone. His plane absorbed more than 2,000 holes from friendly fire. By some miracle, Tucker survived and landed safely. By morning, fewer than 550 men of the 504th had gathered at their objective. The regiment had been shattered before it even faced the enemy. The disaster hardened the survivors. Men who had watched their friends die from American bullets learned that death could come from anywhere at any moment, from friend or foe. They stopped expecting fairness. They stopped expecting safety. They expected only to fight, and if necessary, to die. Sicily also taught them something else. Even in chaos, the scattered paratroopers who reached the ground fought with devastating effectiveness. Small groups of 5 or 10 men attacked German convoys, destroyed communication lines, and caused confusion far behind enemy lines. The Germans could not understand how American soldiers kept appearing in places where no Americans should have been. This was the essence of airborne warfare. Strike from unexpected directions, hold ground the enemy thought was safe, and make them afraid to sleep. 2 months later, the 504th jumped again, this time into mainland Italy at Salerno. Allied forces were being pushed back toward the sea by German counterattacks. General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, was desperate for reinforcements. He requested the paratroopers be dropped directly onto the beachhead behind friendly lines to stabilize the collapsing front. The situation was critical. German panzer divisions had counterattacked with devastating force. American and British units were falling back under heavy fire. There was real fear that the invasion might fail, that the Allies could be pushed back into the Mediterranean as they had been forced out of France at Dunkirk 3 years earlier. Clark needed soldiers immediately. He could not wait for reinforcements from North Africa. The paratroopers would have to do. The drop on September 13, 1943, succeeded where Sicily had failed. This time, commanders took no chances with friendly fire. General Clark issued strict orders. All anti-aircraft batteries on ships and shore were to hold fire from 9 p.m. until further notice. He met personally with naval and ground commanders, sent representatives to every unit, and made sure everyone understood. The aircraft followed a route that skirted the invasion fleet, avoiding nervous gunners. Any soldier who fired on the incoming planes would face a court-martial. The aircraft arrived without incident. 1,300 paratroopers floated down onto a beachhead marked by barrels of burning gasoline. The fires were crude but effective, visible for miles and guiding pilots to the drop zone. The paratroopers assembled quickly, formed into units, and moved to the front lines. The next morning, they attacked. Altavilla, a village overlooking the beachhead, became one of the fiercest battles of the Italian campaign. Whoever held Altavilla controlled the approaches to the beachhead. The Germans understood this and had fortified the village with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. They were determined to hold. German forces poured fire onto the advancing paratroopers. The terrain offered almost no cover. Men crossed open fields under direct fire. Artillery shells exploded around them. Machine gun rounds cut through the ranks. Companies were reduced to platoons. Platoons were reduced to squads. Soldiers fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets, and when ammunition ran out, with their fists. The fighting became hand-to-hand in the streets, room to room in shattered buildings. During the battle, a staff officer suggested Colonel Tucker withdraw to more defensible positions. Casualties were mounting, and the attack had stalled. A tactical retreat could let the paratroopers regroup and attack again with better preparation. Tucker's response became legendary. "Retreat? Hell, send me my other battalion." The 504th took Altavilla and held it against repeated German counterattacks. When the fighting ended, Tucker and 2 of his men received the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions. The regiment had proven itself in offensive combat against entrenched German positions. But the real test was still ahead. On January 22, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, 30 miles south of Rome. The plan was to outflank the German defensive lines that had stalled the Allied advance through Italy. Instead of jumping from planes, the 504th landed by sea to help establish the beachhead.
The initial landing met almost no resistance. The Germans were caught off guard. For a few hours, the road to Rome lay almost undefended. But Major General John Lucas, commanding the landing, chose to consolidate the beachhead instead of pushing inland. He waited for reinforcements, built up supplies, and prepared defensive positions. The Germans did not wait. Within days, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring rushed reinforcements to Anzio. Artillery on the surrounding hills began relentless bombardment. German troops dug in along every approach. The chance for a quick advance vanished. Anzio became a siege. The 504th was assigned to defend the right flank along the Mussolini Canal. This waterway ran through flat farmland that offered no cover from German observation posts on the hills. Every movement during daylight drew artillery fire. Every night brought probing attacks from German infantry. For the first time, the paratroopers were fighting a static defensive war. This was not what they had trained for. Airborne soldiers were meant to strike fast and hard, seize objectives, and move on. Now they were stuck in trenches like soldiers of the First World War. They endured constant shelling, slept in foxholes filled with freezing water, ate cold rations, and faced attacks that came without warning. The conditions were terrible. Rain turned the beachhead into a swamp. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Trenches filled with water that could not drain, and men stood in mud that reached their knees.
Trench foot disabled hundreds of soldiers. Their feet swelled and turned black from standing in cold, stagnant water day after day. Walking became painful, almost impossible. Every step was agony. Some men could barely carry their rifles. The smell of wet boots and rotting socks mixed with the mud of the flooded trenches. Malaria began to spread, a hidden enemy, after the Germans deliberately stopped the pumps that drained the surrounding marshland. The reclaimed farmland flooded, turning into shallow pools of brackish water that bred millions of mosquitoes. Every night the men were bitten. Every day new cases appeared. And above it all, the shells fell without pause. From the Albano hills, German artillery observers could see everything on the beachhead. Every road, every supply dump, every aid station, every command post was within their sight. Every shell was aimed with precision. The bombardment was constant. Men learned to listen to the sound of incoming shells. They learned which ones would land near them, which ones might miss. But there was no reliable way to avoid them. Death could strike while walking to the latrine. It could strike while eating breakfast. It could strike while sleeping in a frozen, water-filled foxhole. Then came Anzio Annie, a massive railway gun that fired shells weighing over 500 pounds from positions so far back behind the German lines that American aircraft could not locate it. When it fired, there was no warning. When its shells landed, they destroyed everything within 50 yards. There was no rear area, no place to hide. The beachhead was only 7 miles deep at its widest point, which meant that every square yard was exposed to German fire. The psychological pressure was immense. Veterans who had survived the chaos of Sicily and the brutal fighting at Salerno began to crack under the strain. Some developed what doctors called combat fatigue, known in earlier wars as shell shock. They trembled uncontrollably. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow, every distant crack, every rustle in the mud made them jump. Some had to be evacuated. Others, unable to bear the strain, took their own lives. Fresh replacements arrived from training camps in the United States, young men who had never seen combat. They arrived full of confidence, only to be killed before they learned the names of their squad mates. Men might arrive in the morning and be dead by afternoon without ever firing a shot at the enemy. It was a place where death was random, unfair, and constant. But the 504th Paratrooper Infantry Regiment did something different. They refused to be passive.
They refused to simply dig in and wait to be shelled into submission. From the first day, Colonel Tucker demanded aggressive action. Every night, squads of paratroopers crossed the Mussolini Canal and slipped into German lines. The men moved silently, faces blackened with burnt cork. Dog tags were taped to prevent noise. Their knives and bayonets were ready for silent killing. Grenades were held for emergencies. Rifles were on half-cock, ready to fire instantly at a moment's notice. These patrols became a nightmare for the Germans. The Americans mapped artillery positions, scouted fortifications, and captured prisoners, dragging them back across the canal for questioning. They destroyed vehicles, supply dumps, and equipment with carefully placed demolition charges. They killed sentries quietly in the dark, and then they vanished before dawn, leaving the Germans to discover the destruction long after the Americans had disappeared. By early February, the Germans tried a massive counterattack to push the Allies back into the sea. 36 battalions of German infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, struck at the heart of the beachhead. It was one of the largest attacks the Germans would ever launch in Italy. Adolf Hitler himself demanded the Anzio beachhead be destroyed. British divisions in the center bore the brunt. Their lines buckled under German armor and infantry. Units were overrun. A breakthrough seemed imminent. If the Germans reached the beaches, they could cut the beachhead in half and destroy Allied forces piece by piece. The 504th was ordered to plug the gap. H Company had only 25 enlisted men and 2 officers. A full-strength company had nearly 200 men. They had no food. Supply convoys could not reach them under constant artillery fire. Water was scarce. Ammunition was nearly gone. Yet they were sent forward into unknown territory where British lines had collapsed and German forces advanced freely. Lieutenant James Miguel led a patrol to scout German positions. Miguel was 26, a Greek-American from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. He had studied at Ripon College before the war. He had already been wounded twice in Italy and would be wounded again before the campaign ended. At the time, he was simply doing his job, leading his men into danger because someone had to. That night, Miguel and his men crawled through the darkness, moving low and silent, until they stumbled into advancing German troops. The enemy was moving confidently, calling out in German, certain their breakthrough was near. They did not expect resistance so far behind the front. Miguel ordered his men to dig in along a railroad embankment. They were isolated, cut off from supply, without communication to headquarters, with no reinforcements coming. For the next 24 hours, 27 Americans held their position against repeated German assaults. Wave after wave of infantry attacked. Mortars bracketed the embankment. Machine guns swept their foxholes. Ammunition ran low. Weapons jammed from continuous firing and had to be cleared by hand. They fought because there was nowhere to retreat, no one to relieve them. They fought because that was what paratroopers did. When reinforcements finally arrived, H Company had suffered only 1 casualty. They had stopped the German advance in their sector. The 3rd Battalion of the 504th, including G, H, and I companies, received one of the first Presidential Unit citations awarded in the European theater for actions from February 8 to February 12, 1944. The citation recognized extraordinary heroism, but official recognition mattered less than what the men had proven to themselves and their enemies. They had shown they could be surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, they would still fight. The Anzio beachhead held. The German counterattack failed. Both sides settled into a grinding stalemate that would last for months, under constant shelling, in freezing mud, fighting illness and terror, but never giving up an inch.
The 504th had been at Anzio for 63 long, grueling days. During that time, the regiment suffered nearly 600 casualties, about 1/4 of its total strength. 2 of the 3 battalion commanders were wounded.
Companies that had landed with 150 men were reduced to 40 or 50. Every man knew the cost of holding the beachhead. Every man carried the memory of friends lost, of foxholes flooded with cold water, of the never-ending shelling that had filled the nights with fear. Finally, on March 23, 1944, the survivors were withdrawn. Landing craft carried them back to Naples. From there, they sailed to England to rejoin the rest of the 82nd Airborne Division. They were expected to jump into Normandy for the D-Day invasion. They trained for it, they planned for it, but when June 6th arrived, the 504th stayed in England. Their losses in Italy had been too severe. They did not have enough experienced men to conduct another combat jump. The regiment that had been baptized in the friendly fire disaster over Sicily, that had held the Salerno beachhead against relentless German counterattacks, that had earned its fearsome nickname in the frozen mud of Anzio, watched from a distance as other units jumped into France. They would not wait long for their next fight. On September 17, 1944, the 504th parachuted into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history. The plan was audacious, the brainchild of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. 3 airborne divisions were to seize bridges across multiple rivers in German-occupied Netherlands, creating a corridor 60 miles long through enemy territory. British armor would drive up this corridor, cross the Rhine River into Germany, and push into the heart of the Reich. If the operation succeeded, the war might be over by Christmas. The operation was given a code name, Market Garden. Market referred to the airborne assault, the seizure of bridges. Garden referred to the ground advance of armored units. Both parts had to succeed, or the entire plan would fail. The 504th was assigned to capture bridges over the Maas River and the Maas-Waal Canal near the city of Nijmegen. These bridges were critical. Without them, British tanks could not advance to the final objective at Arnhem. Unlike previous combat jumps, this one would be made in daylight. Commanders believed daylight would reduce the chaos and confusion that had plagued earlier drops. The men were not convinced. Daylight meant the Germans could see them coming. It meant anti-aircraft fire would be more accurate. It meant landing in open fields with no cover. But they jumped anyway. The paratroopers landed in wide open fields, fully exposed. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the sky around them. Some men were killed as they hung in their parachutes, drifting helplessly. Others landed directly among German positions and had to fight the moment their boots hit the ground. Within 4 hours, the regiment had seized its assigned bridges and secured the surrounding area. It was the fastest capture of any objective during the entire operation. While other units struggled with scattered drops and disorganized resistance, the 504th moved with brutal efficiency. But one bridge remained in German hands, the highway bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. This bridge was essential. Without it, British armor could not advance to relieve the 1st British Airborne Division, which was being destroyed at Arnhem, 10 miles to the north. American and British forces tried to take the bridge by ground assault for 2 days, but every attempt failed. German defenders had turned the southern approaches into a killing field. Every step toward the bridge brought fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery. General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne, ordered a desperate gamble. The 504th would cross the Wall River in assault boats and seize the northern end of the bridge while ground forces attacked from the south. The crossing would be made in broad daylight across 400 yards of open water directly into prepared German defenses. The boats were flimsy canvas crafts supplied by the British, wooden frames, no motors. Each could carry 13 paratroopers and 3 engineers to paddle. The 504th had never trained on these boats. They had never practiced a river crossing under fire. They hadn't even seen the boats until they arrived just before the attack. The boats were supposed to arrive early in the morning, but traffic jams along the single road supplying the Allied advance delayed them until mid-afternoon. Every hour of delay gave the Germans more time to reinforce, more time to prepare, more time to kill. Finally, when the boats arrived, the paratroopers had to assemble them under enemy fire. Canvas stretched over wooden frames that were difficult to erect. Some boats were missing paddles, some had holes that had to be patched, some would not hold together at all. Colonel Tucker asked a British tank officer if his men had ever done anything like this before. The officer looked at the fragile boats, looked at the 400 yards of open water, and looked at the German guns across the river. He shook his head. Tucker's reply became famous. No, they are getting on-the-job training. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, H and I companies of the 3rd Battalion carried their boats across a dike and launched into the Wall. British tanks laid down covering fire. British artillery tried to create a smoke screen on the far bank, but the wind blew it away. The Germans could see everything. As the first boats hit the water, machine guns, mortars, and artillery opened fire. Men died carrying their boats to the river. Some swamped and sank in the swift current before even reaching halfway. The river was running high from recent rains, and the current was stronger than expected. Boats drifted downstream, away from their landing zone, into more German fire. Paratroopers paddled with rifle butts when they ran out of oars, paddled with their hands, or bailed water with helmets, still trying to reach the far bank. The crossing took 15 to 25 minutes, depending on where each boat landed. Every minute felt like an eternity. Soldiers were shot, fell into the cold water, and were dragged down by their equipment. Blood mixed with the river. Bodies floated downstream. Boats were riddled with holes and began taking on water. Only 11 of the 26 boats survived to make a second trip. Those who reached the far shore did not stop to regroup. They charged directly at the German positions, screaming, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, and attacking with bayonets. The paratroopers who had watched friends die in the river were relentless. By 6:30 in the evening, the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge was in American hands. The longest bridge in Europe had been captured, and the 504th had accomplished what seemed impossible. A British officer who witnessed the crossing later wrote that it was the most gallant action he had ever seen. General Gavin called the Wall River crossing one of the finest feats of arms of the entire war. The crossing became legendary within the airborne community, proof that determined infantry could accomplish missions that seemed suicidal on paper. But the victory was not enough to save Market Garden. British armor that should have raced across the bridge to relieve Arnhem inexplicably stalled on the south side. By the time they finally moved, German reinforcements had sealed off the northern approaches. The 1st British Airborne Division, trapped at Arnhem and running out of ammunition, could not be saved. Of roughly 10,000 British and Polish paratroopers who landed there, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. market garden, which was supposed to end the war by Christmas, became one of the greatest Allied defeats of 1944. The 504th had done everything humanly possible, yet even their heroism could not change the grim reality of the operation.
The 504th remained in Holland through November, locked in a relentless, grinding, defensive battle. German counterattacks never stopped. The flat Dutch countryside offered no cover. Every man, every foxhole was fully exposed. Artillery observers in the distant hills could see every movement. The men lived in flooded foxholes, standing in icy water day and night, eating cold rations, their feet swollen and black with trench foot, their bodies constantly battered by exposure. When they were finally pulled off the line, they had been in combat for 56 consecutive days. Nearly 500 additional casualties had been added to their already long list. Some rifle companies were reduced to mere handfuls of exhausted survivors. The men were sent to France to rest and refit. But the respite lasted only 4 weeks. The war would not wait. On December 16, 1944, 3 German army groups launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack came with complete surprise. American units in its path were overwhelmed. Front lines collapsed almost instantly. Chaos spread like wildfire. The 92nd Airborne Division received orders to move immediately. There was no time to gather equipment, no time to plan, no time to rest. The 504th loaded onto trucks and drove through the night toward Belgium, uncertain of exactly where they were going or what awaited them. The ride lasted 18 hours through freezing rain and snow. Many trucks had no canvas covers. The men had no heat. They huddled together, sharing whatever warmth they could, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Along the way, they passed columns of retreating American soldiers. Men who had been overrun by the German offensive moved silently, eyes hollow, weapons discarded. Some had given up entirely. But the 504th did not throw away their weapons. They checked their ammunition, they sharpened their knives, they readied themselves to fight. Their destination changed mid-route. Originally headed for Bastogne, they were redirected north to block the advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the German offensive. This force, led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, was nearly 5,000 men strong, supported by more than 100 tanks, including the massive Tiger II heavy tanks, machines far superior to anything the Americans possessed. These were elite Waffen-SS troops, ideologically fanatical and already guilty of massacring American prisoners at Malmedy. The 504th arrived near Werbemont, Belgium, on December 18th. They immediately marched toward the sound of gunfire. There was no time to dig defensive positions, no time to coordinate with other units. There was barely time to eat. The temperature was below zero. Snow blanketed everything. Roads were ice sheets. Men slipped and fell constantly. Some developed frostbite within hours. On December 20th, the regiment attacked the village of Chinon, held by elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper. They had no tank support, no artillery preparation, no air cover. The same weather that had allowed the German offensive to surprise the Allies grounded all aircraft. The paratroopers advanced across 400 yards of open ground, laced with barbed wire every 15 feet, into a storm of heavy machine gun fire, 20mm cannon fire from armored flak vehicles, and fire from German armored reconnaissance units. It was the heaviest enemy fire they had ever faced, worse than Sicily, worse than Salerno, worse than Anzio, worse than the Wall River crossing in Holland. Men fell with every step, but the survivors pressed on. They did not stop to help the wounded. They did not pause to take cover. They charged directly at the German positions, firing their weapons, throwing grenades, closing to hand-to-hand combat. They took the village anyway.
The fighting in Chinon was brutal, house to house, room to room. Paratroopers kicked down doors, sprayed rooms with automatic fire, threw grenades through windows, and charged through the smoke and explosions. When ammunition ran out, they used bayonets and rifle butts. Belgian civilians were trapped in the village. Some hid in cellars, others were herded into the church by the Germans. When the Americans finally secured the church, they found dozens of frozen, terrified civilians who had been imprisoned for 3 days without food or water. Over the next several days, the 504th continued a series of savage engagements that gradually trapped Kampfgruppe Piper. Unable to advance, unable to retreat, and cut off from resupply, Piper was forced to abandon his vehicles and escape on foot with what remained of his command. The Battle of the Bulge raged into January 1945. The 504th fought in conditions that rivaled Anzio in misery. Snow fell constantly. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Soldiers developed frostbite while manning defensive positions. Hot food was impossible to deliver. Wounded men froze before they could be evacuated. When the battle finally ended, the 504th had been in combat for 42 straight days. Some rifle companies had fewer than 50 men remaining. But the war was not yet over. In the spring of 1945, the regiment participated in the final drive into Germany. They crossed the Rhine River in one of the last opposed river crossings of the war. They advanced deep into the collapsing Third Reich, pushing through ruined cities and shattered countryside. Fighting was sporadic, but still deadly. Fanatical German units resisted even as their country fell apart. Snipers hid in rubble. Teenagers armed with anti-tank weapons ambushed convoys. The war was clearly won, but soldiers still died every day. On May 2, 1945, a platoon led by Lieutenant James Miguel was among the first American units to liberate Werblin concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What they found there defied belief. Bodies were stacked like firewood. Thousands of emaciated corpses lay in piles, waiting for burial. The few prisoners still alive weighed less than 70 pounds. They could not stand, could not speak, staring at their liberators with hollow eyes that had seen horrors beyond words. The 504th had seen death before, had lived with death for nearly 2 years, had caused death, but nothing could have prepared them for Werblin. Miguel later said the experience haunted him for the rest of his life. The soldiers never forgot what they saw. It confirmed why they had fought. It justified every sacrifice they had made. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The 504th Paratrooper Regiment had fought in every major European campaign except Normandy, which they missed due to casualties in Italy. They had made 4 combat jumps, Sicily, Salerno, Nijmegen, and one final jump into Germany. They had conducted an amphibious assault at Anzio. They had crossed a river under fire at Nijmegen. They had held impossible positions and captured seemingly impossible objectives.
The war was over, and the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment marched in formation through the conquered capital of the Third Reich. They passed the ruins of buildings that had once housed the Nazi leadership, towers and palaces shattered by Allied bombs. General George Patton, watching the parade, turned to his aides and said that in all his years in the Army, in all the honor guards he had ever seen, the 82nd Airborne was undoubtedly the finest. That day, the division earned a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. But the men of the 504th kept their original identity. They remained the devils in baggy pants. Colonel Reuben Tucker, their wartime commander, left the regiment after the war. He continued his career, eventually retiring as a major general in 1963. He later served as commandant of cadets at the Citadel, shaping a new generation of officers with the same discipline and determination he had demanded of his soldiers. General James Gavin, who had commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, wrote in his memoir that Tucker was probably the best regimental commander of the entire war. Tucker passed away in 1970 at the age of 58 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in South Carolina. Lieutenant James McGillis returned home and went on to serve 2 tours in Vietnam. He documented his wartime experiences with H Company in a memoir titled All the Way to Berlin. Though he had been nominated twice for the Medal of Honor, he never received it during his lifetime. In 2020, at the remarkable age of 103, McGillis finally received his recognition and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Ross Carter, a rifleman with H Company, was wounded in the arm during the fighting at Chinon in December 1944. He recovered enough to return to combat in February 1945 and served until the war's end. Afterward, Carter returned to Virginia and began writing about his experiences. He worked from memory and letters he had written in the field, chronicling the men in his squad, their jokes, their fears, how they lived and how they died. He wrote with unflinching honesty, refusing to romanticize the brutality of infantry combat. His brother, Boyd, a professor of literature, helped edit the manuscript and suggested the title, Those Devils in Baggy Pants, taken from the German diary entry that had first named the regiment. Published in 1951, the book became one of the most acclaimed first-hand accounts of World War II infantry combat. Critics praised its honesty. Veterans said it captured the experience of combat more authentically than any other memoir. It sold over 1 million copies and remained in print for decades. Carter, tragically, did not live to see the success of his work. He died from cancer contracted during post-war Arctic operations, only 28 years old. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment continues to serve today. It is assigned to the 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. Modern soldiers, like their forebears in 1942, are volunteers who undergo rigorous training emphasizing the same qualities that defined the original paratroopers: physical toughness, mental resilience, and the willingness to jump into battle wherever they are needed. Every soldier who joins the 504th studies its history. They learn about Sicily and Salerno, about Anzio and Nijmegen, about the Battle of the Bulge. They understand the river crossings, the amphibious assaults, the desperate last stands. They are tested on this knowledge. They carry forward a legacy spanning 80 decades and multiple wars. The regiment has deployed across the globe, to the Dominican Republic in 1965, Grenada in 1983, Panama in 1989, Desert Storm in 1991, Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. The unit has earned 4 Presidential Unit citations for extraordinary valor and has been commanded by officers who later became some of the U.S. military's senior leaders, including Generals William Westmoreland, David Petraeus, and John Campbell. But every soldier who joins the 504th learns the same fundamental lesson that the men at Fort Benning learned in 1942. Airborne soldiers are expected to accomplish missions that others cannot. They fight outnumbered and surrounded. They hold ground regardless of the cost. They strike, they hold. And they remember a German officer who died in a frozen foxhole in Italy, leaving behind a German diary entry that would echo through history. American paratroopers, devils in baggy pants, are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I cannot sleep at night.
They pop up from nowhere, and we never know when or how they will strike next. The officer understood what his commanders never fully grasped. Some soldiers cannot be defeated by numbers or firepower alone. They can only be killed, and even then, others will take their place. By 1944, the German army had conquered most of Europe. They had defeated Poland, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They had never encountered an enemy they could not crush. But they could not crush the devils in baggy pants. The paratroopers did not care about odds. They were trained to fight surrounded. They expected to be cut off. Their doctrine was simple: land behind enemy lines, hold, and fight until relief came, or until death. They did not surrender. They counterattacked when retreat was easier. They held when retreat was safer. They asked for no glory. Most came home and resumed ordinary lives. They rarely spoke of what they had done. Those who wrote memoirs did so reluctantly, decades later. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as soldiers doing their duty. The true heroes were those who never came home. History, however, remembers them differently. History remembers the devils in baggy pants.